Good morning.
Ma'am, I have a question. मैम कॉस्ट पुश इन्फ्लेशन एंड डिमांड पुश इन्फ्लेशन, मैम ये इन्फ्लेशन का कॉज है या फिर टाइप है?
टाइप कैसे होगा? टाइप तो आपको शुरू में बताए। इन्फ्लेशन का टाइप अगर आप कहेंगे तो दैट विल बी क्रीपिंग इन्फ्लेशन, वॉकिंग इन्फ्लेशन, गैलोपिंग इन्फ्लेशन. That will be types of inflation. Then you will be talking about how food inflation is measured, कि इसको मेजर कैसे करते हैं या इसको नापेंगे कैसे, मापेंगे कैसे. तो you will talk about WPI, CPI, core inflation, headline inflation. So measurement में भी types होंगे. फिर उसके बाद we will talk about what are the causes of inflation. So what are the theoretical reasons behind inflation? So there are two important theoretical reasons. One is the demand pull and the other is the cost push. समझ में आई बात आपके?
यस मैम. मैम ये दोनों साथ में आकर कर सकते हैं किसी कंट्री में, जैसे दोनों साथ में हो?
क्यों नहीं हो सकते? Inflation is there, so there can be different reasons behind inflation. And these are not the two only reasons. There can be other reasons also. But yes, they can exist together. आपकी इंडियन इकोनॉमी में ये दोनों साथ में एग्जिस्ट करते हैं हर जगह. दैट्स व्हाई आई वाज सेइंग कंटिन्यूअसली आपको ये बात बता रहे हैं कि ये समझिए कि जब प्राइसेस के चेंज की बात करेंगे, so you have to understand that relative prices are also changing. Some things are becoming costlier and some things are not. So it is not that when you are saying inflation, all the prices are rising at the same rate or they are rising simultaneously. So in some cases there can be the supply shortage, in some cases there can be the demand shortages. Both can exist. Anything else?
Yes, ma'am. मैम आपने एक सेंटेंस का लिखवाया था, एट फुल एम्प्लॉयमेंट इन्फ्लेशन बिकम्स डिसइंसेंटिव फॉर प्रोडक्शन बिकॉज कॉस्ट ऑफ प्रोडक्शन विल राइज फास्टर. मैम इसे समझा दीजिए.
कॉस्ट ऑफ प्रोडक्शन कब बढ़ेगी, क्या कह रही है?
सेंटेंस लिखवाया था, एट फुल एम्प्लॉयमेंट इन्फ्लेशन बिकम्स डिसइंसेंटिव फॉर प्रोडक्शन बिकॉज कॉस्ट ऑफ प्रोडक्शन विल राइज
फास्टर. देखिए, keep in mind what is full employment. Full employment is a situation where you have already utilized the resources. Complete utilization of resources is taking place in the economy. Okay, so if you are at full employment, I hope you all can see the screen. If you are already at full employment, yes, so if you are already at the full employment, means if the economy is already at full employment and if the prices are continuously rising, so you know that the supply curve is vertical already. So supply cannot change. And why supply cannot change? Because you have fully utilized the resources. So if you want to increase the output now, you have to pay higher price to accumulate resources first. So if after full employment you want to increase the output, the immediate effect will be cost of production. Because cost of procuring the inputs will increase. You remember that we talked about this? Q is a function of LK. So if you want to increase the Q, you have to increase this L and K. But because you are already at the full employment level, so you do not have excess of L and K. all labor and capital is utilized already. So you want new capital and new labor. So from where it will come? Either you want new laborers. So suppose it is not there. So what you will do? You will ask these labor to do overtime. So if you are asking them to do overtime, you will be paying them high. So that's how in the market the demand as the demand for labor and capital will go up, prices will go up, and therefore cost of production will go up. So because the cost of production is rising too faster in the economy, so profit is what? Profit is revenue minus cost. So cost is rising faster, and therefore the profit will not be rising faster, because profit को increase करने के लिए revenue को cost से ज़्यादा increase होना चाहिए. It's not necessary that when you are already at the full employment level, maybe the revenues will be increasing faster. Now, because of the rising cost, profit slow rate से बढ़ेगा या profit decline करेगा, and this becomes an disincentive for the producer. Yes, anything else which you want to understand? Okay, if not, so let us we'll be talking about Phillips curve today. See, I hope you can see these diagrams. Can you see this?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, ma'am.
So these are few graphs related to your Indian economy, or how the variables are changing. And this is the if you see this is the food inflation. So this graph is the food inflation. Now you can see that this graph has lot many points of change. Sometimes it is going up, sometimes it is going down, and there is a huge fluctuation. So if you remember, I told you that when we talk about core inflation, in the core inflation, food and fuel inflation is excluded. It is not considered in core inflation. Why? Because food prices are very volatile. So the volatility you can see here through the graph. The graph is moving up, moving down, and it is frequently moving up and down. So if you talk about CPI, this is the consumer price index for India. The change in the consumer price index over the time period. So you can see that continuously there is a rising trend. The data starts from 2017. Okay. So you can look at the previous figures also. You will find that over the time period, inflation has always increased. So prices generally have a tendency to move in the upward direction. But which prices you are saying? You are talking about total prices, average general price in the economy. Relative prices, maybe there are some commodities for which over the time period price has come down. For some commodities price has gone up. But when we will talk about average of prices, general prices, so there is always an upward trend. Okay. So this was CPI. Now this is one graph which you might have seen many a times. This is GDP growth rate for Indian economy. And this is very recent, okay? You can see from the, like you can see, check your GDP growth rate from 2000 or maybe from 1990. So you can observe here that earlier the growth rate was decreasing, right? Even before the pandemic, the growth rate was declining. So from 2018 or from 2017, there was a slow decrease in the GDP growth rate from 5.6% to 3%. And then this range was negative. Okay. And then the GDP growth has started picking up. So you can see that there is a downfall, then like this, then like this. So there is a fluctuation. So there are business cycles in the economy which keeps on taking place. Okay, now one more thing. See this. This is the unemployment rate for the Indian economy. Okay. And you can see that when there was a negative GDP growth, the unemployment rate was very high. So there is always an inverse relationship between GDP growth and unemployment. If the GDP growth is high, unemployment is low. And if the GDP growth rate is low, unemployment will be high. So now what we are discussing is the Phillips curve. Phillips curve is proposed by a British economist in 1958, and this is A.W. Phillips. So he says that there is an inverse relationship between wage inflation and unemployment. So this is an inverse relationship between wage inflation and unemployment. Means when wage inflation is high, unemployment is low. And when wage inflation is low, unemployment is high. So either the economy can have an inflationary situation or either the economy will have unemployment situation. So if the inflation has to be controlled or if the inflation rate is very low, unemployment will be high. Or if you want to keep the unemployment at a very low level, then there has to be a high inflation in the economy. And this can be shown by just a simple downward sloping graph like this. On the x-axis, you are taking unemployment rate. On the y-axis, you are taking wage inflation. And the curve is like this. Okay, so this is known as Phillips curve. So you can see here, if the wage inflation is high, the unemployment rate is low. Okay. If the inflation rate is low, unemployment rate is high. So why it is there? A.W. Phillips has looked at the time series data for the US economy and some other economies. So for 20 years, 30 years, when he was trying to understand the data, then he found that whenever the inflation rate is high, there was a low unemployment in the economy. And through that, he proposed this relationship. Are you able to understand this?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. So see this curve. So what he was trying to understand is that over the time period, how wages have changed. Wage inflation simply means percentage change in wages. So you can see in the diagram, there are some dots and there is a line, or there is a curve which you can see. So dots are the data points which he found that when the inflation, suppose you consider this point. So what this point indicates, that the inflation rate was between 8 to 10%, say 9%, and the unemployment rate was very low. Or think about this, or say this point. So during these days or this point, during this time period, or whenever the inflation rate, the wage inflation rate, or the increase in the wage rate was low in the economy, in those time periods, the unemployment rate was quite high in the economy. And that's how he proposed that there is an inverse relationship between wage inflation and unemployment. So wage inflation is a type of supply push inflation. As I told you, that when we are talking about supply push inflation, we can talk about profit push or wage push. So wage is rising. Wage rising means cost of production is rising. So when cost of production is rising, now in the economy, what we find is that if the wages are increasing at a higher rate, labor will supply the labor more, or labor will supply its labor services more, and therefore less number of people will be unemployed. And if the wage rate is increasing at a very slow rate, so more number of people will be willing to opt out of work, and therefore the unemployment will be high. So if money wages are high, if change in money wages is high, if change in money wages is high, unemployment will be low. And vice versa. If change in money wages is very slow or is very small, then people will be less interested in getting employed. So to some extent, this appeared to be correct when in 1958 he was talking about. But in 1970s, the situation got reversed. And then from 1970, people were questioning that whether the Phillips curve exists like this, because it was an inverse relationship. So in 1970, what happened, or in the decade of 1970, it was the time period of stagflation. And stagflation is a situation where there is a slow GDP growth and unemployment both together. So stagflation is what? Slow GDP, high unemployment, high inflation. These three things are together in the stagflation situation. So in the 1970s, many of the Western countries, mainly European countries, they experienced this situation where the GDP rate was low, GDP growth rate was low, so therefore automatically there will be high unemployment. But at the same time, with the low GDP growth rate, the inflation was rising. Now, why inflation was rising? Because the GDP growth rate was slow, but the demand was rising faster than supply. So inflation was very high. So then there was a question that although Phillips curve said that there is inverse relationship between two, but during stagflation, there was a positive relationship between these two. Is it okay? Are you able to understand?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Anyone needs any clarification here?
Ma'am, that line, if change in money wages is high,
Unemployment will
is
be low.
complete.
Ma'am, when it is
That is
below
how you are
the
talking.
zero line,
Why it is below the zero line means if suppose the see on the y-axis what you are taking. That is what we are saying. Percentage change in money wages. Okay. So the relationship is between percentage change in money. It is not wages. Okay. It is not simply wages, but it is the percentage change in money wages. So here you are taking unemployment rate. So suppose the money wage rate is changing. Say by 6% or by 8% or by 10%. So that means if the today wage rate is 400, in the next time period or in the current time period, the wage rate is increasing by 2%. So 2% of 400 is added now, or 4% of 200 is added. So if the change is not there, suppose the money wage rate is declining. So if the money wage rate is declining from previous period, then the growth rate will become negative. Because there is no increase in the money wage. Money wages are actually decreasing. So if the money wages are increasing and it is increasing at an increasing rate, then employment will be low. That is what it is explaining. So once the money wage rate change becomes negative, then the unemployment will continuously rise. As the money wages are decreasing, the unemployment rate is rising. But till the time wages are increasing in a positive direction, then you will observe that there is an inverse relationship. So after a point, maybe the inverse relationship will not exist. But Philip says that if the money wages are rising, the unemployment rate will move in an inverse direction. That is what he was saying. Is it okay now?
Yes, ma'am.
Excuse me, ma'am.
Yes, yes.
Ma'am, when you are writing, then it's showing some delay, ma'am. Please, can you explain again? Ma'am, I think network issue at your side, ma'am.
Okay. Just wait, okay? I will rejoin. Maybe there is
Okay,
a
ma'am.
problem. Is it visible now?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, ma'am.
Now suppose that inflation rate in the economy is say 13%. Okay, currently if suppose the inflation rate is 13% and unemployment rate is 8%. Unemployment rate is 8%, inflation is 13%. Okay. Now, if the inflation increases to 20%, the unemployment rate reduces to 4%. Or if the inflation rate even rises further, say 23%, the unemployment rate is reducing to 3%. So as the inflation is reduced, unemployment rate rises, and as the inflation increases, as the rate of inflation increases, rate of change in prices increases, then the unemployment rate decreases. This is the inverse relationship. Okay. So remember, this is the rate of change in money wages or the prices. So money wages जितना ज़्यादा बढ़ रहा होगा, unemployment उतना ही कम होगा. Why? What is the reason? The reason is that if the wage rate is continuously rising, less people will be interested in sitting idle. They will work more, or they will be willing to work more. We are not talking about real wages here. Obviously, you understand that if the inflation is high, the real wages will be low. But the point is that the unemployment rate will be low if the inflation rate is high.
Sorry, ma'am. Excuse me, ma'am.
So this, yes.
Ma'am, same problem again happened, ma'am. Your voice is breaking and video is not showing. Yes, ma'am. Now
Is it
it's
for
visible.
everyone?
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
Yes, ma'am.
So just give me 5 minutes, okay? So, okay, are you able to listen to me?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, ma'am.
Let us see. I'm sharing the screen now. Let us see how it goes. So, is it okay now? Is it better than earlier?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes,
If
ma'am.
I write something, just see if I write something, are you able to see this?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes,
Okay.
ma'am.
So this is Phillips curve and this is in short known as PC. Okay. So when Phillips observed that there is an inverse relationship between wage rate and unemployment rate, so he proposed this. But later on, when stagflation was experienced across the economies, then people were thinking that does Phillips curve exist all the time? Or it can be always said that there is an inverse relationship between inflation and unemployment. ये relationship क्या हमेशा exist करती है? So then there were certain economists who said that maybe Phillips curve exists only in the short run. Okay, short run. So in the short run, maybe wages and unemployment will be inversely related. But generally, if the wages are high, unemployment will be high. Because if you are thinking from the perspective of firms, if the wage rate is rising faster, their cost of production will be rising, and they will be interested in employing less people. So their unemployment rate is high. If you think from the labor perspective, labor who is applying its labor services, for labor, you know that the supply curve of labor will always be upward sloping. That means higher the money wage, higher will be the supply. So if higher is the supply, the lower will be the unemployment rate. Now, try to understand this that A.W. Phillips is a supporter of Keynes, J.M. Keynes, right? And he is a Keynesian economist. So what he is saying is the demand is continuously rising in the economy. The economy is not at full employment. The economy is before the full employment. The demand is rising. Aggregate demand is rising. So in the situation when aggregate demand is rising, if the money wages increases, unemployment comes down. So all those economists who criticized Keynes, they criticize this Phillips curve also. They say that what if the demand is not rising? What if the full employment is there in the economy? So then economists are of the view that Phillips curve in the short run can be like this. So in the
Excuse me,
long
ma'am.
run, the Phillips curve, yes.
मैम
happened?
आप जो लिख रही हैं आप जो लिख रही हैं वो दिख नहीं रहा है फिर से।
नहीं दिख रहा है?
मैम बीच बीच में
मैम
पॉज हो
अब
जा रही है।
दिखने लगा।
मैम आप दिख
अब
रहा
दिख
है।
रहा है। तो अगर आप इस कर्व को देख पा रहे हैं तो यहां पर क्या है कि द ब्लैक लाइन और द ब्लैक ग्राफ is telling you the short run Phillips curve, SRPC, short run Phillips curve. So short run Phillips curve is always showing inverse relationship between the two variables. But in the long run, economists say that it becomes vertical at a point, at a particular rate of unemployment, the Phillips curve will become vertical. So in the short run, the Phillips curve is downward sloping, but in long run, the Phillips curve will become vertical. That means unemployment is not directly affected by the wage rate. Whether the wage rate is rising or decreasing, it does not affect the unemployment rate in the economy. So then, later on, economists were of the consensus that in the short run, Phillips curve is downward sloping, but maybe in the long run, the Phillips curve will become vertical. So that's how you see the relationship. Now, if you talk about okay. So now let us see the equation, how you can explain the Phillips curve. So what you are saying is that in very simple terms, inflation
Ma'am, your video is paused.
So let us disconnect the class because I don't think that I will be able to.
Okay, ma'am.
Maybe the problem is because of the screen sharing.
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, ma'am. Okay, ma'am.
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, ma'am.
Sometimes it is there. So I hope you have understood the concept. We'll meet in the next class. If you have any question, we have 5 minutes more.
Yes, ma'am.
Excuse me, मैम हम नेक्स्ट क्लास में आप
Yes, keep on saying.
repeat करेंगे।
थोड़ा तेज बोल सकती हो क्या?
एक बार ब्रीफली रिपीट कर दीजिए मैम, बिकॉज नेटवर्क इशू के कारण समझ नहीं आया।
Let us try to summarize this. We are talking about inflation, okay, types of inflation, effect of inflation, theories of inflation. So when we are discussing inflation, there is another theory behind inflation, and that is Phillips curve. So it is not actually a theory, it is just a hypothesis. So it says that there is an inverse relationship between percentage change in money wage and unemployment rate. In other words, there is an inverse relationship, or there is a trade-off. Trade-off is important, okay? In macroeconomics, trade-offs are important. So it's a trade-off between inflation and unemployment. So every time the inflation is high, unemployment will be low. Because if the inflation is high, there are two things which can take place. If the inflation is high, one is that money wages, or in money terms, wages are rising faster. So if in money terms wages are rising faster, labor will be supplying the labor more, and therefore less number of people will be employed. Think from the another perspective. If the prices are high, if the prices are rising faster, firms will be able to make more profit. So if they are able to make more profit, they will be interested in employing more labor. So therefore unemployment will be low. So high inflation, low unemployment. Low inflation, high unemployment. Later on in 1970s, when countries experienced stagflation, so this was considered a short-run relationship. In the short run, in a very small duration, there can be an inverse relationship between unemployment and inflation. But in the long run, maybe this relationship will not exist. Therefore, the short-run Phillips curve is downward sloping, and long-run Phillips curve is vertical. I hope now it is okay.
Yes, ma'am.
मैम यदि मतलब ये जो मनी वेज है इसके प्लेस पे मैम रियल वेजेस होता तो फिर कैसा रिलेशन होता अनएम्प्लॉयमेंट के साथ?
नहीं, रियल वेजेस का तो हो ही नहीं सकता, बिकॉज सी ट्राई टू अंडरस्टैंड द कंटेक्स्ट ऑफ दिस थ्योरी. When Philip was proposing this relationship, first is that Phillips is talking about the question of whether prices are flexible or not. देखिए, क्लासिकल थ्योरी में हम बार बार इस बात पे एम्फसाइज करते थे कि प्राइसेस फ्लेक्सिबल हैं, जो कि इकोनॉमी को फुल एम्प्लॉयमेंट पे हमें रखते हैं. तो डिबेट 50s में इकोनॉमिस्ट इसी बात पे कर रहे थे कि प्राइसेस फ्लेक्सिबल होंगे या नहीं होंगे, और हमेशा होंगे या नहीं होंगे. So in that context, Phillips is saying that if the prices are rising faster, that means from every year the price is increasing. So if there is an increasing trend, then unemployment rate will rise. So he is talking about a situation where we are only concerned about money wages. Real wages की बात कर रहे हैं. So there's no point in talking about what type of will be there if real wages, because we all understand that if the real wages are decreasing, unemployment will definitely rise. So there is always a positive relationship between real wages and unemployment. But try to understand that if there is a distress situation, अगर लॉकडाउन हो जाए तो लॉकडाउन में तो वैसे ही रियल वेजेस कम हो जाएगी, लेकिन उस समय लोग अनएम्प्लॉयड अपनी इच्छा से नहीं होंगे, फोर्सफुली होंगे. So that is why there is no need to establish a relationship between real wage and unemployment. But how unemployment or how employment will respond with respect to money wage, that is the question. आज किसी टाइम, आज अगर गवर्नमेंट मान लीजिए मनी वेज इंक्रीज कर दे, तो क्या ज्यादा से ज्यादा लोग एम्प्लॉयमेंट में आना चाहेंगे? और सपोज ये मान ले कि करंटली बहुत सारा अनएम्प्लॉयमेंट है इकोनॉमी में, तो क्या ये मान ले कि इन्फ्लेशन रेट बहुत लो है इकोनॉमी में? इसका मतलब इस अनएम्प्लॉयमेंट को खत्म करने के लिए बहुत हाई इन्फ्लेशन रेट चाहिए इकोनॉमी में. So only concentrate on money wages. Don't think about real wages. Okay, so we'll meet in the next class. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, ma'am.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you, ma'am.